Hi, this is John from John's Workshop, and today our project is this year 2000 Chevy Silverado pickup truck. The emergency brake stopped working, you push the pedal all the way to the floor and you get nothing. So I suspect that the shoes are bad and we're going to have to replace the shoes. So we'll get started. First step is to raise the vehicle and remove the rear wheel. Make sure you've got a good jack stand. You can see I've got a jack stand supporting here. On the side I'm working, I like to keep the jack under there too, just in case something were to slip. But all the weight's on the jack stand. The jack is just there for extra safety. So the first step is to remove the caliper. The caliper's just held on with these two pins that go through here and here. So all you need to do is remove the two bolts and you can slide the caliper out of here. There's actually a flat on this pin. You can get that here. This is 12 millimeter. So we can already loosen that one, but basically that's how you get this one off. And then you do the same thing on the bottom here. Okay, so I'm just taking the top bolt out. You see there was a thread locker in there. So we'll be replacing that when we go to put this back together. And so now this thing, the caliper, we should be able to slide this out of here. There we go. And then you can just put the caliper up here on the leaf spring. You just don't want to have any tension on that hose. You don't want to leave it hanging or anything. And then here's our pins. So these allow the caliper some freedom to move. So just use a screwdriver here and you can pull the shoe out. These shoes are still good, so I'm going to reuse these. I'm just going in to replace the emergency brake there, parking brake. These actually look pretty good. There's a fair amount of material there still left. So for the caliper holder, it's an 18 millimeter. We got 18 millimeter here. We got a pretty long breaker bar. Just makes it a little bit easier. And there's just two bolts that hold this on. There we go. Got the first one. Got the second one. They weren't as bad as you might think for how big of a bolt they are. And there's the caliper holder. We're going to clean that up a little later, make sure these pins are well lubricated. But for now, we're just going to set that aside and keep moving here to get the rotor and the drum off. So this should just pull off of here if it's not rusted. This one may be a little bit rusted here. Oh, there we go. Just kind of shoved on a little bit. I was fortunate there that I was able to get it off. All right, so we set that aside. So here's a close-up. There's our shoe, and then this bolt here is going to be the first step to pulling that off. Just use a little socket here and we'll take that right off. Really not very tight at all. That just holds a retaining clip here, you can see, which just kind of keeps the shoe up against the inner wall there. So here's that clip. And what I like to do is have a magnetic tray. So this gives you a place to kind of put your bolts in. They're not just sitting on the ground getting grit in them. This is actually upside down from the other side. So on the other side, this is at the bottom. And then you see down here, this is the part where the emergency brake cable comes into, and it actually then causes these to expand. It really pushes out on this side here when you tighten up the cable. So the next step is we're going to get this out of here, and there's really not much that holds this in here. See, now that we've got that loose, we can just move this around, and should be able to just, I'm going to try to show you a bottom view here. Pop it off of there. I don't know if you can see that too well, but that should just come right off. There we go. So now it's hanging loose in there. see, I can just kind of move this around a little bit. And it looks like it's almost, it's one of those puzzles, right, that you can't get the piece out because the gap in here is smaller than the axle, so you really can't get it out. I'll show you in just a second. You can kind of work it out. You can see, you can kind of almost get one side out here a little bit, and then once you get that over here, it gives you a little bit of clearance. And look at that. It almost seems like you can't do it, but you can get it out. Interesting. This side, I had no emergency brake, no parking brake. You know, when you push it to the floor, nothing happened. It looked like the wear must have been all on the other side. This side here, shoe actually looks pretty good on both sides, but since I went ahead and bought the new shoes, I'll probably go ahead and put the new ones on. One thing I'd recommend if you're working on the brakes like this is have your compressor, hopefully you have one going, and just have one of these blowers, you know, just to be able to dust this off. It's just really dirty in there. We're going to spray these bolts with some PB Blaster just to get the dirt off so you can get to more better. So here's the problem I have with this dust boot. You can see it's cracked. It's got a hole in there. There's dust and dirt that are getting in there. It's actually pretty bad here. So since I'm taking the time to do the shoes, I'm also going to replace this dust boot here. In order to get to that, unfortunately, we have to take their 4 bolts off right here, here, and down here. And those are 18 millimeter bolts, same as the other. I'm going to hit these with PB Blaster in 2 places, up here by the head for each one of these. But then also on the back side, the threads come out just on the other side here, and we're going to hit those with PB Blaster as well. So here's what I was talking about. This is one of those bolts on the back side. I'm just going to hit this, there's 4 of them, with PB Blaster just to let it soak a little bit and make it a little easier to get those 4 bolts off. So this is kind of a tricky part of trying to get the emergency brake cable off of the little arm here. Here's what I'm going to try doing is, so I got a big kind of a flat blade screwdriver here, shoving it in here to kind of raise that spring up a little bit. And then I've got this screwdriver here, which is narrow enough to fit in here into that slot. And so what I'm going to try and do is get this in here to hold that spring off. If I run this up through here, and then I'm trying to get the whole spring in. There we go. So it looks like I can get that little screwdriver all the way through. If you can see how I was able to thread that through. And then I should be able to get this around the corner here. There you can see how I got it around that corner there, and there it came off. So that's the idea. It's a little bit tricky, but it did come off. But that frees up the lever arm here, and then we're going to be taking that out. You can see it's pretty messed up in there because of that dust boot that we're going to replace. And while we're under here, we're going to take off, this is a 13 millimeter bolt here. This just holds a bracket up here for the brake line. But when we start moving things around, it's going to be handy to not have that connected. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that off while I'm under here. And I'm just going to put the bolt back in the hole there, so I don't have to worry about where that is. So to get at those 18 millimeter bolts in there, I ended up having to go with a 3/8 drive here, 18 millimeter with a breaker bar, so I can get that on behind that flange. And then also what I was using was just a little bit of an extra helper bar here. And these bolts they're not really rusty in there so much as there's a pretty good sized thread locker in there And so what I found is you don't really need to like bang on them so much. It's just pull steadily, and then there it goes. And you can feel once you get it moving, there's a lot of thread locking compound in there that really is keeping it from moving. But essentially that's how I got all 4 of these. There we go. And so once you get those, you just pull those off. So this is the mechanism that expands the shoe, taking the 2 sides of it off. These aren't too bad. See, there's a pin in here, so don't lose that pin. And then on this side, there's a adjusting wheel. See that? It's kind of stuck in there a little bit, but it's coming. There it comes. Grease was just kind of gummed up in there, but you can see on that side, this has to be able to turn. Luckily this one turns here, so we can adjust this, but for some reason yours isn't turning. You got to make sure either get another one or separate those 2 so that they can be turned. This is all going to get cleaned up in here and inside that hole there. Get all that old dust and grease out of there before we put things back together. Here you can see one of those 4 bolts, just pulling it out here, and you'll see that thread locker that I was talking about. So there's not so much rust on those that's keeping them from coming out, but there's quite a bit of thread locker on that, and we'll have to make sure we replace that when we go put this back together. So now that the 4 bolts are out, you can see this whole assembly is loose here, and that's going to allow us to get in between these 2 pieces here, this outer piece of sheet metal and then this casting. There's a couple of tabs here that are kind of holding things together. On the top side here you can see there's this little tab. I'm just going to pry this back a little bit like that, and that's going to allow this sheet metal here to separate from this a little bit more, and then down below that's going to give us enough clearance to be able to get that rubber boot out of there. Here I am just kind of pulling it out from in between there, which is the whole reason we had to take those 4 bolts off, is just to get that separated enough to get this dust boot out. So there it is, and you can see it's well, it's full of dust. So it really wasn't doing its job there. It's kind of broken. So I've got a couple of these ordered from AutoZone. They'll be in, I think, tomorrow. And so in the meantime, I'm going to just spend some time here cleaning up the inside of this cylinder here, mechanism, and making sure that all the old grease and grime is out of there, so we put it back together with fresh grease, it'll work properly. So here's the caliper carrier, and this has got the pins, so we want to clean those while we're taking this thing apart here. You see the grease in here is really not too great. It's kind of starting to dry out. So while we have this apart, I'm going to essentially just clean these things off. There's a rubber dust boot here you can see that will come off and allow us to clean these things up. There we go. So I'm just going to use some PB Blaster here and wipe these things clean. Also, I'm going to clean this hole here and blow that out with the compressor just to make sure all the dirt is out of there. And then we'll put some new brake caliper lube. This just happens to be Permatex. I like this pretty well. Use this on the German cars too. Seems to hold up pretty well over time. So I'm going to use that to reassemble the caliper carrier here. So now this is all cleaned up. I'm going to put a little bit of caliper grease. This stuff works pretty well to lubricate these pins. This is what it looks like. It's kind of a green-blue consistency here. I just kind of smoosh that around on the pin, make sure there's plenty there, a little on the end. I've cleaned I had the rubber boot off, cleaned that up, put it back on, and then you can see here we're just gonna put this back in, distribute the grease around, and then these move much easier than they did when I started here. So yeah, that old grease was really dried out, so this will allow the caliper assembly to float back and forth much more easily as you apply the brakes and let off the brakes. Hey, I just got back from AutoZone. They had to order these in, so I would recommend, if you're gonna do the brake shoes, to check your boots first and see if you're gonna need to get those, because it could delay your project if you need them and the local AutoZone doesn't have them. But here's what they look like. So there you go, there's the new one and the old one. Yeah, you can see the old one wasn't doing its job anymore. I think that's probably why we ended up having this problem, because all that dirt got in there and kind of jammed up the action. So when you put the parking brake on and then went to release it, I don't think it ever released, and I think that's what wore down the shoes originally. So hopefully with this new dust boot in here, we'll be trouble-free. Here's all the parts. They're all cleaned. Just make sure that you can thread these smoothly together, because you're going to need to be able to rotate this to adjust. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is the new dust boot, and you can see, since we've got this space in between here, we're looking at the bottom. See, we can kind of slide this guy in here, and it's just gonna kind of, there it is, pop into place. You can see that. And then when these two pieces come together, you can see that's going to trap the dust boot in there. So when this is all bolted back together, that dust boot is then held in place. So now that the dust boot is in there, it's time to put these bolts back in. There's 4 of them as we took them out. So I just recommend cleaning the threads off a little bit, and then we're going to go ahead and put that thread locker. There was thread locker in there. You could tell I like to use a liberal amount here just to make sure we got plenty on there. I don't want any chance these are backing out while we're driving, so something like that. And then you've got some time to assemble it. So I'm going to put all 4 of those bolts back in there and tighten them up. You can see about how tight they are. I think they're probably, I couldn't find on the internet a torque specification, but I'm sure it's probably around 120 foot-pounds, something like that. What I'm going to do is just tighten them up essentially as tight as I felt like I pulled them off when I was loosening them. As you're putting these 4 bolts back in, don't forget about that tab. Remember, we kind of had to bend that out of the way a little bit, so just make sure that as you're putting it back together that that's out of the way as you're tightening things up. Otherwise you're going to kind of crush that underneath there. So you want to just kind of maybe bend that out a little bit just to make sure everything has clearance to go back together here. So just tightening up these 4 bolts with the Loctite on them. So all 4 of these bolts are now back on tight with the Loctite in place. And look under here, there's our brand new dust boot. Move this out of the way, and we're ready to put the parts back inside this little emergency brake cylinder. This is a view of the new dust boot. And one thing I wanted to point out was this is not a symmetric boot. The little hole is actually offset. It's not in the center of this, the length of this. And the way you want to put that in is like this, where that little hole that's not quite halfway is a little closer to this side than it is to this side. So you'll see there's like a little bit smaller area here than there is right over here. So when you go to put those dust boots on, just remember there's one way that they're supposed to go. I don't think it's going to be super critical if you get it the wrong way, because it's not offset that much, that little hole. But there was some reason that they did that, and I think it's because when it's sitting in here normally, there's less deformation of this rubber piece if you put the little hole shifted more towards the end of this. Here are the clean parts ready to go back in. You can see there was a bunch of dirt in here, but this is clean now. Here's the pin that goes in there. That actually makes contact here, like that inside the cylinder, and then this of course is the piece that allows you to change the adjustment on the parking brake. So all of those are going to go back in the cylinder there, and I picked up some of this brake caliper grease, and I'm going to use that liberally inside that cylinder to make sure these parts get well lubricated. The next step is I've got to get this in here, and I think it's easier to do that. See, like this, if you do that first. Okay, now you should be able to slide that in the boot. Okay, there we go. While we're down here, don't forget we've got this bracket up here that we took off earlier. Go ahead and put this one back in. Make sure you get that one in and tighten up. Here's our new brake shoe. It's a Duralast from AutoZone, and it comes with a sort of a little bit different kind of bracket that will hold the top of this against the back there. A little bit different than what was original equipment. So our next step is to put this back on, pretty much the reverse of how we got it off. There we go. There's 3 places where the shoe rides, and this is one of them here. So we want to make sure we hit that with a wire brush here. Just kind of clean that off a little bit, and put a little bit of caliper grease right there, just to help that shoe move around a little bit. So that's one of them right here. The other one is down here. Point it out here, right there. And then you'll see the other one is down here where my thumb is. So you just want to make sure you hit all of those with a wire brush, and then put a dab of grease back there before we put the shoe assembly up into place. So the next step is to get this shoe just kind of stretched out between these. The slots have to be vertical in here. So I kind of put this back here on the back one, and then try and pull this one a little bit there, and then it kind of slips on. I had to try this a couple times. It's a little bit tricky, but there you go. It's on. And at this point, I'm going to put that grease in there I was talking about in these points where it rides, so that when I push the shoe assembly back, it will be in contact with that grease. Okay, so kind of clean those up a little bit, and I'm just going to put a little bit of grease right there where it rides, and I'm going to do that on all of these places, trying not to get any grease on the actual shoe material itself, which would kind of defeat the purpose. This last one is a little bit tight, so I'm going to use a screwdriver here and work that grease into that contact point right there. Just make sure we have a little lubrication there for the side of the shoe as it moves. Hopefully you can see that. Next step is to put these braces in there that support the top. I saw the new screw that came with it. I actually like the older screw better, so I'm going to put the old screw in. This one isn't too rusty, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the old screw. It just looks a little bit better to me. So put this up in there, line up the hole, and in it goes. You just tighten that up. just snug. All right. And before we put the rotor on, we just want to make sure that this flange here is clean. The rotor's going to come on and off a few times because we've got to adjust basically the max diameter here so that we're just getting some dragging with the drum. In the directions that came with these, it says you could use a vernier caliper to measure the width here. Well, I don't have a vernier caliper. I'm not sure how well that'll actually work. I'm going to just use the old-fashioned drag method where you essentially expand this until you just start to feel it dragging, and then you go in like a couple clicks. Next step is to adjust the brake shoes, and I'm showing the driver's side here just to show you that it's up free to rotate, and I've just put a couple lug nuts on here kind of backwards just to hold this side in while we go work on the other side. I should point out too that while you're doing this adjustment, you want to be putting on the emergency brake and then releasing it in between fit checks to make sure that everything's centered up inside the back of the drum there. Okay, so first step, we're going to take the drum off. There we go. All right, so this is not adjusted yet, but I did press the parking brake and release it, so it should have centered up our assembly in here. So the next step is, you can see the adjusting wheel here. Essentially you want to unscrew this. As you can see, I'm turning it this way. That essentially unscrews that and makes this longer. So that's expanding the shoe, and we really want that expanded as much as we can without too much dragging. Key part of this is to make sure that if you have a ridge here on the outer side of this, that you take that ridge off, not with just a wire brush, but you really want to get in there with something like a sander or even a grinder to get that ridge off of there. Otherwise, that just confuses the measurement. So I just expanded it a little bit, and you can see I put it on and I really don't feel much dragging. So essentially, just keep doing this. Put it on, take it off. If you're not getting enough dragging, unscrew that a little bit, and you put it back on. Just be patient, and you can feel it still slides right on. One of the keys here, of course, is that both sides are up and elevated, so it's easy to rotate this. So I'm going to put a significant amount of turns on this, and we'll take another look. Starting to feel a little bit more dragging as I'm pushing the rotor on there. I can tell I'm starting to drag a little bit, and you can see I'm having a little bit more difficulties getting this off. Sometimes it helps if you rotate while you're turning it. Rotate while you're pulling it. And another little bit here, and I think we're pretty close. You can actually see a little bit of wear up here from just sliding that on, and it's probably more like dirt that's getting on there, not so much wear. But now you can see it's not really going on now. So I think I'm right about where I want to be. The one thing you want to do is make sure you don't get this wedged on here, because if you just start yanking this off, you'll just pull that shoe, and as you remember that bracket, there wasn't much to it. So you want to try to be very careful as you're trying to get this on and off like that, that you don't really pull, because there's not much holding this on here, just that little tiny bracket. There's a little bit of dragging there. So what I'm going to go do is do one more engagement, and I'll be back. All right, just let the parking brake off one more time. Now I can start to feel it's dragging. It actually got a little bit more clearance just by doing that. I'm gonna go a little bit more here. So you can see by going back and applying the brake, releasing it, and then readjusting, I'm able to expand those shoes even more than I would originally thought if I hadn't done that. So this is a final adjustment, and you can see here how far I ended up moving this adjustment. So I turned the star wheel until, you know, this is about how much I added. The other side was roughly about the same, but you just have to go by feel. Kind of depends on the rotor, the inner drum diameter on the rotor, how much you're going to need to adjust it. But I would encourage you to go back and forth with putting the emergency brake on, trying to extend this, go back and forth and iterate on that to get the right measurement. Since I'm not replacing these, the disc pads, they would come with these new channels. Going ahead and using this PB blaster to just kind of clean off these channels, because we're going to want to have those fairly clean, and then put caliper grease in there to just help the pads slide around in there. So before you put this back on the caliper carrier, you want to go ahead and clean those off where the pads are going to ride. This is the caliper carrier bolt, and we're putting thread locker on here using the red. And the next step then is to go ahead and get the caliper carrier here. So you can see I've got these metal pieces cleaned off, and we're ready to go ahead and replace this. Okay, so I've got the two caliper carrier bolts in, just torquing them. Got my torque wrench set to 140 here. There we go. Since I'm going to reuse the pads, I'm just going to hit these with a wire brush on the mating surfaces where they're going to go into these channels, and then we're going to put a little bit of caliper grease on there just to make sure that they ride easily back and forth in the channel there. I've got the caliper grease here, and I'm going to just put a little bit, just a little dab in this area where the shoe is going to ride there. See? Okay, and then on the pad itself, putting a little bit of, just a little coating of that same grease here on the surfaces that are going to be mating in there. Now we'll put this back in like that, and same on the other side. Next step is to get the caliper ready to put back on. It's kind of handy to have one of these tools. You don't absolutely need it, but it's a way to push the piston back in a little ways. You don't need a lot, just want to provide a little bit of clearance to be able to get the caliper back on. We just kind of put this in here like this and turn it a few turns. It's not going to take much, and now we have the space we need to slide the caliper over the pads. And now the caliper is ready to put on. Slides on just like that. And then we've got the two bolts, one up here and one down here, that hold that on. Those also have had Loctite on them, so I'm going to replace the Loctite before I put those back on. Okay, so the job's done. Don't forget to torque your lug nuts. 140 foot-pounds on this, so you want to make sure you get everything torqued down nicely. There we go. And that's all there is to it, to replace the emergency brake shoe and also the dust boot if you've got that problem too. Thanks for watching. Hope this was helpful.